Hello, everyone. My name is Phoenix Ablaze, and welcome to the Tiki Oasis monthly series focusing on subjects of history, appropriation versus appreciation of cultures, minority cultures, Tiki culture, and mid century Americana. The goal of this series is to provide a forum for education, knowledge, and conversation. Through this series, we invite marginalized groups to amplify their voices, to share their knowledge and experiences. We invite advocates and allies to ask questions, and we invite all to contribute to the broader discussion on diversity, inclusion, representation, and equality in the Tiki community. As we dive into our monthly series, there are many topics to unpack, discuss, and understand that are part of the current Tiki culture. For our topic this month, we have invited Mariah Kunkel to share with us the impact of colonialism and imperialism on the Pacific region. Throughout the conversation, please put your questions in the chat or Q&A section. Also note that this talk today is a benefit for Pasifika Project. Pasifika Project cultivates grassroots advocacy and seeks to raise awareness on important issues impacting the Pacific Islands and their people. We ask you to consider a PayPal donation to tikioasis@gmail.com, and those proceeds will be shared with the Pasifika Project. Without further ado, I am proud to introduce Mariah Kunkel.
Hello. Is this working? Am I on? Yes. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen real quick. All right. First, before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the original Indigenous occupants of the land that I am joining you from, the Tataviam, and their elders past and present. Many thanks also to Tiki Oasis for the opportunity to present today, and many thanks to everyone who is joining us. I'm really grateful for your donations, and wanted to let you know that all proceeds donated will benefit Pasifika Project, which is an organization I co-founded with my collaborator Samuel Jimenez, which primarily focuses on cultivating community and opportunity for individuals of oceanic descent within the spirits and hospitality industries, as well as functioning as a much needed platform for cultural-based education and exchange. As I said before, my name is Mariah Kunkel, or I didn't say that before. My name is Mariah Kunkel, and I identify as a Black and Indigenous Pasifika woman. I was born and raised in California, and I am joining you from Los Angeles today. I have been in the spirits industry for approximately 7 years, primarily on the supplier side, working for artisanal brands and craft suppliers in the marketing, branding, and social media fields. Oh. Through my father, I am CHamoru, the name of the original occupants of the Mariana Archipelago. Through his mother, my grandmother, my Nana, Rosa Lizama Kunkel, who was born and raised on Guahan, or Guam, the largest island in the Marianas. Our family or clan name is Kichu, and we are from the village of Barrigada. The Marianas are currently divided into 2 separate territories or colonies that are both currently administered by the United States. You may be familiar with the term Guamanian as a descriptor for people from Guam. This term was created by the US military, and its use is contested, especially among people of CHamoru descent, whose ancestors originally moved freely throughout the archipelago. I would like to make clear that I am what would be called Micronesian. I am not Polynesian. While all Polynesians are Pacific Islanders, not all Pacific Islanders are Polynesian. So what do we mean when we say Pacific Islander? And just how many people are we talking about? Pacific Islanders are indigenous people from the oceanic subregions of Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. Please note the Pacific Islanders are not considered Asian, even though we are frequently grouped together. As of 2018, within the US, Pacific Islanders account for approximately 1.4 million people, or 0.5% of the population. Over half of all Pacific Islanders are located in California and Hawaii. I would like to make clear before discussing any further my family and these very personal views that I have about Tiki and colonization that I make no claim to speak for anyone other than myself. There's no Pacific Islander monolith. There exist a variety of opinions on all of these subjects, and I would advise you to seek them out as well. I'm here to speak my own truth, and I am grateful to Tiki Oasis for that opportunity today. And I hope it will be the beginning of an ongoing conversation. I'm also not willing to debate or justify to anyone the existence of racism, white supremacy, sexism, misogyny, colonialism, nor my experience or perceptions of any of these subjects. I'm not here to tell you who is bad or good, or to provide you with a checklist on how to be a good person. I'm not here to make you believe anything or make you stop believing in anything. And I also recognize that Tiki appropriates from many different cultures. However, today we are going to be focusing primarily on Pasifika. With this conversation, I'm hoping to provide you with historical and cultural context that will hopefully aid you in your own approach to Tiki. I'm hoping to help you see the direct correlation between Tiki and colonialism in the Pacific, the harm that Tiki can perpetuate, even unintentionally, and how that stands in conflict with the spirit of hospitality. At its heart, hospitality is meant to extend a feeling of friendship and welcome. And there are some of us who do not feel welcomed by Tiki, not because we enjoy being offended or we don't like fun, but rather we view Tiki as a link in a long chain of events that continue to impact our islands to this day. At the end of the day, how you feel about Tiki is going to be up to you. What I am most hopeful in talking to you today is that I get to focus your attention on this massively beautiful part of the world, the people who live there, the cultures they keep alive, and the issues that they face. We get to move beyond narrow stereotypes and party themes. And I get to talk about my Nana. So I can't think of a better way to spend the day. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a brief roadmap for our conversation. First, we're going to discuss the process of decolonization. Then we move into a bit of Pacific geography and history. Next, we'll examine the period of contact and colonization by Western forces. Then we'll briefly touch on colonial themes found within Tiki. And then together we'll envision a way forward, as well as examine conditions in the Pacific as of today. So decolonization. Decolonization is an integral part of the ongoing work to dismantle ingrained white supremacy within our society that has seized public attention in a new and dynamic way as of late. It is important to note that decolonization is not a term or process that is universally applicable, even though it has become something of a misapplied buzzword. Decolonization is for colonized people. The process of unsettling is for those who hold power, privilege, and priority as a result of colonialism. I invite you to personally examine the privileges that you hold, especially with respect to this inquiry. This process begins with an accounting of harm and, for colonized people, a rediscovery and honoring, perhaps even a mourning, of the past to better understand the present. This process requires a decentering of the default point of view, which is usually white, cisgendered, heterosexual, and male, and a recentering of the colonized and/or indigenous point of view. It requires an active rejection of truths or propagandist history that was formerly held, and an honoring of alternate histories. This is a painful, ongoing process involving uncomfortable truths and does not necessarily reach its natural end when white people are made to feel better about themselves. This process also seeks solidarity with other Black and Indigenous people of color, or BIPOC, as well as our collective liberation from white supremacy is intimately linked. Our individual struggles are very different. It requires the recognition that while Black and Indigenous people of color may not have created systems of oppression, they can still contribute to their existence, as well as the oppression of other Black and Indigenous people of color, even if unintended or unintentional. This is our generation's sacred offering, to decolonize for our future descendants, to be a good ancestor, in the words of Layla Saad. And I'm excited that we are having this conversation here today together. I would like to ask that you attempt to change your frame of mind as we enter this next portion of the discussion. In general, the West knows surprisingly little about the Pacific and the people who live there. And what information they do receive is usually heavily filtered through media and laden with cliches. Informed mostly via cartoons, popular culture via vacations, popular culture sources like Disney cartoons, the All Blacks and their pregame haka, American football players, old-timey colonial adventure stories like Mutiny on the Bounty, celebrities like The Rock and Jason Momoa, and, frankly, tiki bars. To be clear, when we talk about the Pacific, we are talking about the single largest feature on Earth. It covers nearly 64 million square miles. It covers about 46% of the Earth's water surface and about 32% of the Earth's total surface area, making it larger than all of the Earth's land area combined. But because most maps Americans see split this massive body of water in half and will have it hang off the edges while the Americas take center stage, this expanse is reduced to an afterthought, along with its islands and its people. In this ocean, there are 25,000 islands of varying sizes and physical features. However, for most of us who grew up on the mainland, I would like for you to challenge your concept of the relationship between land and sea, which likely places priority on dry land. When thinking of the mighty Pacific and all of the islands that it contains, I ask you to think of this world as a sea of islands, as described by scholar Epeli Haofa, rather than simply tiny islands in a vast sea. In his words, our Pasifika ancestors were connected rather than separated by the sea. Far from being sea-locked people marooned on coral or volcanic tips of land, islanders formed an oceanic community based on voyaging. The world of our ancestors was a large sea full of places to explore, to make their homes in, to breed generations of seafarers like themselves. People raised in the environment were at home with the sea. They played in it as soon as they could walk steadily. They worked in it. They fought in it. They developed great skills for navigating their waters and the spirit to traverse even the few large gaps that separated their island groups. Theirs was a large world in which peoples and cultures moved and mingled, unhindered by boundaries of the kind erected much later by imperial powers. From one island to another, they sailed to trade and to marry, thereby expanding social networks for greater flows of wealth. They traveled to visit relatives in a wide variety of natural and cultural settings, to quench their thirst for adventure, and even to fight and dominate. The boundaries that Haofa references are names that you might already know and that I referenced earlier when introducing myself: Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. These are colonizer terms. Our ancestors knew no such terms, and while arguably they're still somewhat useful as regional descriptors, they serve to divide us, even amongst ourselves, even today. And entrenched in these terms are obvious sentiments of anti-Blackness. Polynesia, first used in 1756 by the French writer Charles de Broche, originally applied to all of the islands of the Pacific. In 1831, Jules Dumont Urville proposed a modification to the three sub-regions during a lecture to the Geographical Society of Paris. Polynesia, or many islands, is the region that's probably most familiar to Americans, as Hawaii is within this group. It consists of a triangular area that is bounded by Hawaii to the north, Rapa Nui to the east, Aotearoa, or New Zealand, to the west. Micronesia, or the small islands, contains four major groups: the Mariana Islands, the Caroline Islands, the Marshall Islands, and the Gilbert Islands. Guam is the largest island in Micronesia. Melanesia, or the islands of the black-skinned people, includes Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, and the Solomon Islands, and it is explicitly named for the darker complexion of some of its inhabitants. I personally prefer the use of terms like Pasifika, Pacific Islander, and Oceania, which reflects Haofa's sentiment that the ocean does not separate us, but rather connects us. However, I also recognize that even among Pacific Islanders, we have a lot of work to do internally to dismantle the internalized racism that can be associated with our sub-region identities. It is generally thought that the prehistoric movement of people across this great sea began sometime around 3000 BCE and originated most likely in Taiwan or the Malay Peninsula, pushing west, establishing the original settlements in Melanesia as well as Micronesia and Polynesia. These seafarers, the Lapita people, were most active between 1600 and 500 BCE and were the ancestors of the later cultures of Oceania. The Lapita voyaged thousands of miles in massive seafaring canoes laden with animals, crops, family members, using only the sea, sun, and stars to guide their way. Their descendants, the Polynesians, continued to explore and settle in the Polynesian region, with Aotearoa and Rapa Nui likely being last by 800 CE. There is also credible evidence that they reached the Americas based on the appearance of the sweet potato, native to the Americas, throughout Oceania. Our ancestors established complex and advanced cultures, largely based around oral traditions, each with their own cosmologies, belief systems, legends, languages, dance, music, social customs, systems of government, and morals. Many of our societies were matrilineal. Many shared commonalities, sometimes even mutually intelligible languages, owing to our shared origins and our great love and understanding of the sea and of seafaring. These beliefs were and are outside of Judeo-Christian and Islamic norms, particularly in their understanding of the relationship of man with the natural world and that which is sacred. As in many Indigenous traditions, the land is literally our ancestor, our relation, for whose welfare the people are responsible. In our cosmologies, the first people are literally born from the land and sea. What happens to our land and sea is understood as directly connected to what happens to the people within them. It is also important to understand that these fully developed, complex societies existed for centuries before Western contact, and that these ways and beliefs were never completely disavowed or lost, but preserved no matter what the cost. To contrast, while our ancestors voyaged thousands of nautical miles, created civilizations, and made their home in the Pacific, Europe was largely in the Dark Ages. Long-distance seafaring in Europe did not truly begin to develop until the 1400s, thousands of years after our ancestors. The Pasifika had no European contact until the 1500s. A typical pattern would sort of follow these steps. First, there would be the first sighting of land by a Western ship. There would be initial contact, and the very beginning of diseases would start to take hold in these new places. Then periodic stops for supplies and the beginnings of commerce would begin. Some Europeans might start to stay on the island. Some natives may depart for work or for adventure or be taken away by force, and more diseases would arrive. Once ports and businesses were established, ships then would begin to make even more frequent stops. Merchants would start to demand land and a sane government. Then arrives plantation economies, missionaries, and even more diseases, as well as imported workers from other places. After that, imperial powers get increasingly involved and formalize their colonization. The first European contact in Oceania was made by Ferdinand Magellan in the name of Spain in 1521. His ship Victoria landed in Guam, and he claimed the entire archipelago on behalf of Spain, which was formalized by 1565 and held for nearly 400 years until they lost the Spanish-American War, at which point possession was transferred to the United States, who continues to hold it to this day. Guam has been a colony for 500 years. You're probably also familiar with Captain James Cook, who completed 3 Pacific voyages in the 1700s in the name of Britain, charting many areas previously unknown to the West. He's also generally credited with establishing first contact with Hawaii in 1778. A little over 100 years later, 90% of Kanaka Maoli, or native Hawaiians, would be dead from diseases and other things. And the Kingdom of Hawaii would be legally overthrown in 1893 by a group of American landowners and businessmen, culminating in American annexation and eventual statehood by 1959. After his discovery of Hawaii, Cook famously mused in his diary at how it could be possible that the people he was encountering on his voyages between these far-flung islands could speak mutually intelligible languages and share common customs. The answer was staring him in the face, literally. He sailed with a number of Tahitian navigators who assisted his journeys by reading the stars and also who translated for him. But centuries of research and theories would result in trying to unlock this mystery of who these islanders were and how they came to live throughout the Pacific. Western colonizers, supremely confident in the superiority of their own cultures, were unable to accept that islanders, with no written languages and no tall ships, could have successfully navigated and mastered this massive body of water thousands of years before they did. The Enlightenment era voyagers not only brought with them a firm belief that their cultures were obviously superior, they also arrived bearing classical educations, art, popular philosophy about the natural state of man, as well as an extensive colonial experience throughout the rest of the world. Settled ideas about Native Americans, as well as Africans and the Orient, provided context for these colonizers as they encountered indigenous cultures in the Pacific. Thus begins a long established tradition of outsiders telling the story of Pasifika, of attempting to explain the Polynesian problem or mystery by creating fantastic and illogical fairy tales that undermine the skill and accomplishment of indigenous seafaring traditions, of projecting onto indigenous women a mythic, precocious, ever available sexuality based around the pleasures of white men, which led to our hula girl archetype, of separating islanders into racial categories based on the color of their skin and the supposed negative and positive traits that were linked therein, dividing the almost white, friendly Polynesians from the decidedly more savage and hostile Black Melanesians. It was during the 1700s, the early Polynesian contact era, that many of these themes were introduced into Western public discourse through the travel writings of captains like Cook, Bougainville, and Wallace, and those who they traveled with. These stories from these voyages were shared, telephone style, a copy of a copy, already badly skewed from their original point of view, creating and cementing myths that lived in popular opinion about the Pacific and the people who lived there, what Pacific Islanders looked like, how they lived, what they believed, what pleasures were available for the taking. These themes continue to evolve, underpin, and justify colonial motives within the Pacific, and serve to rationalize the ongoing entanglements of foreign governments with island nations, as settlers increasingly arrived with every ship. Colonization is a process by which centers of power appropriate someone else's territory and establish control over the original inhabitants. The goal of colonization is to drain the colony of its resources to benefit the imperial power, usually expressed through the extraction of natural or farmed resources, the importation of settlers, and increased militarization. In the Pacific, colonization has taken many forms since initial contact, experiencing different stages and frequently an overlap of types. Here, we'll primarily focus on Hawaii, as it is the example that is probably the most familiar and also had a direct impact on the creation of Tiki itself. Settler colonization is when large numbers of settlers claim land and become the majority. Natives are effectively eliminated, except for use as nostalgia. It is best viewed as a structure and not an event, in the words of Australian historian and writer Patrick Wolfe, meaning that settler colonization is an ongoing system of power that perpetuates the genocide and repression of indigenous people and cultures. It is not a single time period. It is not a single action. It is not something that happened in the past, and it continues to be happening to this day. Viewing settler colonization is currently ongoing, exposes the continuing modalities at work preserving this status quo. And in the case of the representations of colonized people in media and culture. In the case of Pasifika, the industries of hospitality and tourism also play a key role in this messaging. Settler colonization requires the removal of indigenous people as a precondition for settler expropriation of their lands and resources. Indigenous genocide is achieved through the complete disruption of traditional ways of life, the removal and disposition of people from their ancestral lands, the suppression of language, culture, belief systems, and the forced assimilation into settler culture via the importation of new religions, education, military, and labor, and with serious, if not fatal, penalties for non-compliance. This disappearance is also achieved via intermarriage and mixed families. The presumption here is that those of mixed inheritance become less indigenous and more Western or white, and is reinforced by the introduction of policies like blood quantum requirements in a complete disregard to how indigenous people perceive their own identities. For example, in Hawaii, to apply for a Hawaiian homelands lease, an individual must demonstrate that they are at least 50% Native Hawaiian or Kanaka Maoli. Kanaka Maoli are forced into the position of proving that they are indigenous enough to the colonizer nation state in order to be awarded a lease on lands the government has appropriated from their own ancestors, lest they receive special treatment that they are not due somehow. This strengthens the supremacy of the nation state and reinforces the US colonial idea that Native Hawaiians as a people are properly quantified by blood percentage, while that same population will find it harder and harder to qualify for such programs as generations pass, no matter how they personally identify. This blood quantum requirement remains unchanged since the original passage of this act that created the program in 1921 and has actively been protested since its beginning. After the removal of Indigenous people, settlers thereby become the rightful or natural inheritors of the land, of the newly available resources, armed with the intent to civilize the land and maximize profits. As was the case in Hawaii, frequently it was the descendants of early missionaries who amassed land wealth and transformed themselves into a small ruling class that wielded great political power. Under planter colonization, the natural environment is then transformed into large plantations that mass produce single crops. These plantations frequently required more laborers than were available on island, leading to the practice of blackbirding in the Pacific, or the practice of coercing people through kidnapping or deception to work as slaves or poorly paid laborers in countries distant to their own native lands. These laborers were taken from places like the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Niue, Easter Island, the Gilbert Islands, and Tuvalu to work on plantations in Samoa, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tahiti, Hawaii, Australia, and Peru. In a single year, 1862, nearly 1/3 of all of the inhabitants of the island of Rapa Nui were kidnapped by Peruvian ships. Blackbirding began in the Pacific in the mid-1800s and did not end until 1930. However, this practice is still in existence in other parts of the world. Many of the flavors and products that you associate with the Pacific were imported through this process of planter colonization. Sugar, coffee, and pineapples. Dole is an excellent example. While the pineapple is thought of as a traditional Hawaiian fruit, it is actually native to South America. Dole family first arrived in Hawaii as missionaries. Their son Sanford served as president of the provisional government after the illegal overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani and the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1893. He then served as governor after the illegal annexation of Hawaii by the United States in 1898. Sanford's cousin James Dole arrived in 1899. He bought land in Oahu, built a plantation, and went on to found the Hawaiian Pineapple Company, which is the Dole Food Company that we know today. Hawaii's path to statehood from the illegal overthrow in 1893 took nearly 61 years, not until 1959, owing to what was clearly racial anxiety about the population of the colony, as well as the politics of the period. It is important to understand how closely white supremacy is ingrained within white settler colonialism, and also to consider the damaging effects of internal racism, especially in regards to how other people of color might identify and collude with a system primarily designed to benefit white men. The population demographics of Hawaii was frequently thought of as an obstacle to annexation, let alone statehood, with its large number of non-white groups, Native Hawaiians, Chinese, Japanese, as well as those of mixed heritage. Arthur James plainly addressed these issues in his article, The Advantages of Hawaiian Annexation, dated in 1897, the year before the US would annex the archipelago. These excerpts appeared in the North American Review, which is notable for being the United States' first literary magazine. So this is a very large publication. To the question of, have the natives been consulted about what they want? He replies, no, but were the American Indians consulted in the early days here, or the natives of Alaska in later times? The natives have proved themselves to be incapable of governing and unfitted for the condition of civilization, as is shown by their rapid decline in numbers and their inability to adapt themselves to changed conditions. And the importance of their supposed opinions on annexation have been greatly exaggerated. Numbering 500,000 in the time of Captain Cook, they are now reduced to about 30,000 and occupy much of the same relation to the white population as our Indians do here. Indolent and easygoing, they are perfectly content with any form of government which allows them to sun themselves, bedecked with flowers. It is natural that the white man should become the governing power, and in the exercise of this power, it is equally natural that he should wish to turn his territory into a strong, civilized nation for protection and advancement. And then turning to the population, the demographics of the population. It must, however, be conceded to the opponents of annexation that the mixed character of the population is a real drawback. But the difficulties it creates are not insuperable, as our laws already cover the question of Asiatics. The Chinese are not yet dangerous. Their numbers are large, but they are a peaceable people without cohesion, and it would give no more trouble than the same race does in our Western states, where the battle has been fought and the question is now practically settled. If annexed, they would be readily amenable to our laws. The Japanese element is by far the most serious difficulty. Since the war with China, these people have become exceedingly arrogant and self-assertive with the spirit of national aggrandizement that extends from the Mikado to the lowest coolie. From the standpoint of the Japanese, this spirit may be most commendable, but it will have to be firmly met by the United States when our own interests are at stake. The Portuguese are a harmless element. I can see no reason why we should not expect people of the Anglo-Saxon or German race to become dominant, not only in power, but also in numbers, as soon as the question of government is finally settled. Certainly, few Anglo-Saxons or Germans would care to become the subjects of a dusky queen under a constitution like the one that caused the revolution of 1893. James' views on the supposed racial differences, the naturalness of the white man controlling Hawaii, as well as the natives' supposed lack of concern as to who governs the islands, are mainstream American views of the time. These are not unspoken underlying sentiments. These were the kind of statements that were spoken on the floor of Congress. Hawaii aside, by 1900, nearly all of the Pacific had been seized by imperial powers: the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and Chile. In the second half of the 1800s, the US acquired several new territories: Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, American Samoa, the Philippines, and also a number of Guano Islands. Political cartoons of the era are indicative of the prevailing attitudes towards these newly acquired colonies. Many feature strong and paternal Uncle Sam, providing schooling or scolding, supporting childlike colonies, showing them the wonders of white civilization, or providing for their basic needs because they cannot do so for themselves. The countries are frequently portrayed as unkempt, savage, or uncivilized, usually wearing some sort of exotic dress, and they are frequently brown-skinned or black with animalistic features. In this cartoon, School Begins, we see Uncle Sam sort of menacing four small brown children in the front row of the schoolroom. I'm not sure if you can see their sashes, but it's supposed to be the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. The very well-kept white children reading books behind them are places like California, Texas, so other territories that have sort of been brought into line. I'd also draw your attention to the fact that there's a black child literally washing a window in the back corner, as well as an indigenous child reading a book that's upside down, not even part of the class, over by the doorway, with China sort of curiously sticking its head in. I'm not sure if you can read the blackboard, but I'll read it for you. It says, "The consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies whether they consented or not. By not waiting for their consent, she has greatly advanced the world's civilization. The US must govern its new territories with or without their consent until they can govern themselves." Another clear example of the prevailing racial sentiments of the provisional US-controlled government in Hawaii can be found in the Massey affair. In 1932, US Navy wife Talia Massey claimed to have been assaulted, robbed, and raped by a group of young Hawaiian and Asian men. 5 men were arrested, charged, and stood trial. But because there were serious doubts as to the truthfulness of her charges, as well as a lack of evidence, the jury deadlocked and a mistrial was declared. The defendants were then freed in preparation for a retrial. Unwilling to wait for justice, Massey's mother and husband, shown here in the picture, arranged for 2 of the accused men to be abducted. Joseph Kahahawai, a local prize fighter and the darkest skinned of the defendants, he's here in the lower left corner, was abducted, beaten, shot, and killed. The mother and husband were then pulled over by the police and found with Kahahawai's naked body wrapped in a sheet on the floor of their car, on their way to dump him into the ocean. Police also found in their home an abundance of evidence indicating that they had been the one to murder him. They were charged with murder, and a jury consisting of 6 white men, 2 Chinese men, and 4 part Hawaiian men returned a conviction for a lesser charge of manslaughter and recommended leniency. The judge sentenced all involved to 10 years of hard labor in Oahu prison. And the white population in Hawaii, inflamed by yellow journalism, the sort of cartoon that you can see here, was so enraged and so unstable that the territory governor immediately commuted all of the sentences to 1 hour to be served sitting in his office. Events like the Massey Affair and the popular media that reported it presented Hawaii as a place that was terrifying, a racial nightmare full of dark-skinned men waiting to prey on white women. This further complicated the territory's admission to the Union, as well as potentially endangering a burgeoning tourism industry that had begun to firmly establish itself. Tourism, initially limited to very wealthy people to Hawaii, tourist visits remained at about 2,000 people per year from 1872 until 1898. Aided by the introduction of commercial steamships in the 1870s, tourist traffic to Hawaii reached a peak of 22,000 in 1929, before the industry was decimated by the Great Depression. It remained low for a period, but by 1941, aided by the introduction of commercial flights from California to Honolulu, tourist traffic rebounded past pre-Depression levels, with 31,000 tourists visiting Hawaii in 1941. The number of tourists would exceed 1 million for the first time in 1967, and in 2019, approximately 10 million tourists visited Hawaii. Media and artistic representations of Hawaii around the time of the Massey trial are indicative of prevailing ideas about Pacific Islanders and their culture, as well as the perceptions of superiority held by white people about their own cultures and their justifications for colonization. This time period is also known as pre-code Hollywood, meaning it was prior to the imposition of the Hays Code in 1934, which would censor subject matter like nudity, promiscuity, interracial relationships, suggestive dances, and scenes of passion. Popular Hollywood films at the time, like Bird of Paradise from 1932, were openly sensual and featured actual nudity, while communicating a sense of beauty, uninhibited sexual pleasure, primitivism, and danger, frequently oriented around a white male protagonist. If you haven't seen this film, it's available in its entirety on YouTube, so I 100% recommend checking this out. Similarly, the provisional government of Hawaii had a vested interest in promoting visions of Hawaii as pleasurable, peaceful, and feminine, to sway popular opinion towards admission and to continue to entreat tourist spending. This messaging worked in tandem to paint Hawaii as a racial paradise, where white men were assuredly in control of resources, government, and their own heterosexual gratification, glossing over continued colonial violence, racial tensions, and indigenous resistance. Okay, so why is this all important? Why are we talking about trials and cartoons and journalism and movies and stuff? It's important to remember that Ernest Gantt opened Don the Beachcomber in the 1930s in Los Angeles. He was definitely influenced by, or in the very least well aware of, these political discussions, current events, and media messaging about Hawaii and the Pacific. Indeed, he was likely leaning into what was popular at that time. In addition, much of his original decor came from movie sets, and some allege that he actually never traveled to the Pacific prior to opening his bar. It is impossible, or irresponsible at best, to say that Tiki does not reflect any of the racism or colonial sentiment of the time period in which it was originally born, even if it did rely upon make-believe or fantasy to create entertainment. The entertainment was an explicitly imperialistic fantasy. So you might not think of the US as a current imperial power. So pop quiz. How many territories or colonies does the US currently hold? Go ahead and guess. You might be surprised to learn that currently the US holds 16 territories, and that 5 of them are permanently inhabited: American Samoa, Guahan, the Northern Mariana Islands, the US Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. Since the creation of the United Nations in 1946, Guahan, American Samoa, and the US Virgin Islands have been categorized as non-self-governing territories administered by the United States. Since 1946, dozens of colonies around the world have been removed from this list as they either gained independence, some degree of self-determination, or as in the case of Hawaii and Alaska, became US states. There has been no change for Guahan, American Samoa, and the US Virgin Islands. And this is despite the fact that Guam has held 3 referendums indicating interest in becoming a Commonwealth. The US is not at all inclined to make any changes to the status of their colonies. As colonies, the federal government is largely free to administer them as they see fit, without having to worry about the rights guaranteed by the Constitution, as it is not fully applied in the colonies, nor will they face any backlash from voters, as the colonies do not have any voting representation in Congress, nor can the residents actually vote for president. An additional and major reason for keeping Pacific colonies as colonies is related to the strategic importance they provide the US military. When operating within colonies, the federal government is largely free to position their military forces as they like, with little to no input from the colony itself. The Pacific is already home to major military installments, which necessitated the dispossession of native landholders in the past, but also continues to be an issue today as the military consistently seeks to move personnel, equipment, and weapons. Because of this outsized military presence and its displacement of other industries and job opportunities, the colonies also supply an outsized source of recruits for the military. Many are fighting for a constitution that doesn't fully apply to them, only to return home to minimal VA benefits within their home territory. The Pacific has also repeatedly served as testing grounds for both nuclear weapons and warfare games. The implication here is that these areas are expendable. The Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands had 12 years of nuclear testing rained down upon it. Assured that the land would still be safe to live on, the Marshallese continue to suffer devastating birth defects, high rates of cancer, and other serious health concerns from the extended exposure to radiation, and many have been permanently displaced from their own homeland. Bikini has long been code for a breezy tropical sense. However, it remains that actual bikini bodies are sick and living very far away from their own homes. It just seems like there aren't enough people in the Marshall Islands for anyone to care. Henry Kissinger famously said of the Marshallese, there are only 90,000 of them out there. Who gives a damn? RIMPAC, or Rim of the Pacific exercise, is the world's largest maritime warfare exercise. Since 1971, RIMPAC has been held every 2 years in the waters surrounding Hawaii. This defense diplomacy is said to strengthen trust and confidence between countries during peacetime, but it also serves to flex military power between potential combatants to discourage actual conflict. Tens of thousands of soldiers from dozens of countries descend upon Hawaii and stay for 30+ days to simulate a sea battle between countries. Typical activities include urban combat training, amphibious operations, sniper reconnaissance training, ship sinking exercises, missile, rocket, and torpedo launches, navigation exercises, shore-to-ship maneuvers, explosive ordnance disposal, and more. RIMPAC harms Hawaii by polluting and damaging its lands, shorelines, waters, and reefs, by disrupting its marine wildlife with military sonar and underwater detonations, and by causing an increase of sex trafficking to meet the demands of a temporary increase in military personnel. It is without saying that from the moment of first contact, Pacific Islanders were met with an expectation from Westerners that the Islanders would furnish refreshment. The hospitality and tourism industries were born at that very moment when sailors arrived needing food, water, rest, entertainment, and sex. Agricultural norms in the Pacific, largely cooperative and subsistence-based, were shifted to a transactional context to satisfy the needs of transient arrivals. Cultural protocols, formerly used to create strong bonds and a shared belief system, and to preserve and communicate an understanding of the universe and history, became entertainment, devoid of their meaning. Sex was also immediately transformed into a commodity. As Western forces moved their troops into the Pacific to fortify their colonial holdings, hospitality and tourism boomed alongside this militarization. Soldiers, like the early sailors, needed refreshments. Establishments grew in response to these needs: bars, hotels, restaurants, live shows, and brothels. As the United States was increasingly drawn into World War II in the 1940s, fighting Japan in the Pacific theater would require nearly 300,000 US soldiers. My grandfather was among them. Those who were fortunate to return from the war brought with them memories of both the brutal warfare and of much rosier, leisurely moments spent in a veritable paradise. Oh, that's my grandfather. Spent in a veritable paradise where every need could be attended to. Others, like my grandfather, returned with a wife. The mid-century revival of Tiki is obviously linked to the return of these soldiers, as well as a concurrent post-war increase in disposable income and a nation that was eager to quit rationing, celebrate the end of the war, and spend money on fun. Meanwhile, back in the Pacific, as the islands attempted to recover and rebuild after nearly 4 years of warfare between dueling imperial powers, Hawaii was still not a state, and Guam, reclaimed from nearly 3 years of Japanese occupation, the only Americans who lived under enemy occupation, I might add. The military seized approximately 2/3 of the island for its purposes and forbid the Indigenous CHamoru language, among other policies and regulations intent on Americanization. I say all this to highlight the privilege that is inherent to the Tiki fantasy, especially in the mid-century period. Were my grandmother to recreate her experience on island during the war, perhaps it would include Japanese concentration camps and mass killings, and the abandonment of the island by the United States. Meanwhile, my grandfather, likely fed on wartime propaganda and firm in the belief that he was defending the best country in the world, what would his memories and fantasies look like? Would they perhaps look like the hula girl that he had tattooed on his forearm? Would they look like my grandmother? Growing up in Los Angeles, I was surrounded by the remnants of the mid-century Tiki craze in terms of residential architecture. Trader Vic's in Beverly Hills and Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, which is sponsored by Dole, by the way. As a multiracial child, I was well aware that I would not find many representations that resembled myself in mass media. Those messages I did receive about Pasifika cultures years before anything like Moana were usually oriented around hula girls and surfing, and almost always specifically about Hawaii. As I grew into a young woman, the narrow sexualized perceptions about Pasifika women became much clearer to me and definitely shaped the way that I thought about myself. I continue to struggle with my own nostalgia, my own cherished memories of Tiki bars, which is in tension with a more developed recognition of Tiki as a later stage modality of settler colonialism. The representations of colonized people are distillations of imperial ideologies and motives. These representations reflect colonized people's values within colonial cultural and economic systems and inform how Indigenous people should be treated by society. They can also shape how colonized people feel about themselves. Tiki as a predominant source of information and representations of Pasifika people that are consumed by the general public is properly viewed as part of the ongoing structure of settler colonization. As we discussed earlier, white settler colonialism is based on Indigenous genocide. Once virtually erased, settlers typically maintain a refractory imprint of the native counterclaim, usually one imbued with a lot of nostalgia, which legitimizes colonizers as the natural inheritors of the land through this new fused culture. The older culture is deemed ancient, a relic of history, much like ancient Egypt or Rome. And the settler use is frequently referred to as a celebration in honor of ancient times and an ancient people to which they frequently have no real connection to. In order to be nostalgic, it requires the assumption that there are no Indigenous people currently living, or that those who are still living have so thoroughly assimilated into the dominant culture that these old ways have been disregarded or forgotten. This obviously affirms the dominance of settler colonization. This also glosses over the colonial violence that forcibly suppressed Indigenous cultures and languages, and places the fault on Indigenous people themselves for losing or degrading their own culture, and sometimes even seeks gratitude for preserving Indigenous culture through their celebration. It is important to remember that culture is a living thing. It is carried within people. It is not something that has been discarded simply because the people are of reduced numbers or have been forced to completely change in the way that they live. So what does this celebration look like? This typically involves settler adoption or use of Indigenous practices, objects as decor, names, both sacred and not sacred, to confirm themselves as a new sort of native. These cultural elements are stripped from their meaning, history, and tradition to provide fantasy, amusement, or exoticism. This requires the commodification of cultural protocol, as well as the reduction of culture to kitsch or entertainment in the interest of making a profit. This is when culture becomes a costume. Some specific examples of Indigenous celebration by Tiki which contributes to colonial erasure is the use of Indigenous Pasifika names or language, sacred or not sacred, either as chosen names of people, business names, or menu items. Especially when you consider that many Indigenous Pasifika languages were affirmatively suppressed by colonizers in favor of installing their own languages. Entire place names were changed and baby names were forbidden, etc. Also, the use of figurative, sacred, or religious art or deities as drinking vessels or decor. These mere objects have a wide range of names, interpretations across the belief systems of Pasifika cultures. These sacred objects, though definitely beautiful, were never meant simply for decoration or for use in a business logo. When Rapa Nui pleads for Hoa Hakananaia to be returned by the British Museum, where it has been since 1869, when it was stolen without permission and presented as a trophy to Queen Victoria, I'm not sure how to explain that there is a connection between this sacred moai and these people that you cannot appreciate, that even I cannot appreciate. And that is because this relationship is not for me or for you to criticize or analyze, because it is not meant for us. It never was. The moai is a repository of a sacred spirit or life force. They are not simply statues to remember ancestors. To Rapa Nui, they literally are the ancestors. So what does it mean to put a drink in one? What does it mean when you put sunglasses on one for your flyer or wear one on your head? What is it that you're contributing to? Next, we're going to move to Tiki as a method of installing heteropatriarchy. So throughout history, Indigenous women have been forced to navigate the intersection of intimate contact and white settler colonial culture. Pasifika cultures, like others outside the Judeo-Christian traditions, celebrated sexuality and viewed it as a fluid, positive life force. Western stereotypes reduced Pasifika women to one dimension, a passive sexuality that revolved around pleasing white men. Colonized female sexuality was specifically restructured to meet the sexual needs of white men. And her value was in her ability to satisfy her partner. Her own needs, desires, and expectations were completely subordinated. This narrative starts in the Pacific with the arrival of Samuel Wallis, who established the first European contact with Tahiti in 1767. This is actually an engraving from one of the folks that was on the ship. It would begin to entrench expectations and myths of sexual freedoms for white men with Indigenous Pasifika women. The women of Tahiti were judged to be nearly white, physically perfect, passive, pleasing, childlike, and nubile. And undoubtedly, many of these women were actually girls. Allegedly, they contained a mix of innocence and sexuality. Much of this perceived sexuality was projected due to the lack of Christian shame surrounding nudity, which is something that is not all that hard to understand in the climate of Tahiti, as well as the Tahitian heva, which is what this engraving is indicating, is the first dance in Polynesia that Westerners encountered. The hula would overtake this later as the most popular form of dance, which traditionally has a center of gravity in the pelvis, very unlike Western dances at the time. To Westerners, this emphasis on the hips meant that the heva must represent simulated sexual acts, as well as the desire for sex with the newly arrived white men. In the minds of colonizers, there was no way that these dances actually communicated complex histories and cultural messages about the profundity of life. A robust sexual economy eventually developed around this first meeting based on the trade of iron nails for sexual acts with women that completely depleted the ship's reserves and required Captain Wallis to forbid the sailors from completely dismantling the ship in the pursuit of more nails. This initial exchange directly impacted how Tahitians, and Tahitian women in particular, received future ships. It also impacted Western expectations in future encounters with other islands. Women were fully expected as part of the refreshments for the men on the ships, and almost all of the women were assumed available for the right price. It also impacted the sexual health of the islands as the sailors brought with them venereal disease. The Wallis expedition would cast Tahitian women in explicitly sexual terms that would continue to draw Western men to the Pacific with the expectation of consequence-free sexual liaisons with Pasifika women. The ever-present hula girl at tiki bars has her beginnings in these myths, as filtered through later white settler colonial aspirations that made her less Indigenous and more white. She simultaneously represents the gateway to the creation of a new whitened race in the Pacific through heterosexual procreation, as well as serving as a totem of assured male dominance. She is always available, always willing, always sexual. She's almost always nude. She's always young. She's always smiling, usually serving something. And she continues to reduce Pasifika women to the same narrow stereotypes that began in the 1700s. She continues to affect how Pasifika women like myself are viewed, and she definitely affected how my Nana was viewed, perhaps even by my grandfather with that hula girl that he had tattooed on his forearm. So what do we do? What should be done? What's the way forward for Tiki? A quote from Maori scholar Dr. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith: "The intellectual project of decolonizing has to set out ways to proceed through a colonizing world. It needs radical compassion that reaches out, that seeks collaboration, and that is open to possibilities that can only be imagined as other things fall into place." So what do we do now? I have to confess that my personal dream when it comes to Tiki is that we could decide collectively that certain elements shouldn't exist anymore, and that probably we should stop calling it Tiki. And we figure out together an entirely new name and new things to do. Why? Because frankly, I am no longer able to separate the colonizer fantasy from the escapism, because it essentially is a vacation for settler colonizers. People like me exist in the service of this fantasy to either be a servant or a sex receptacle. Because this vacation is premised on a genocide of my ancestors, and it requires my relations to dance on their graves so that they might eat. Because this experience tastes like flavors that were imported from other lands to be cultivated on plantations that enslaved my people. Because these drinks have names that either break my heart or use the sacred names of deities that colonizers tried to make us forget. But mainly because this kaleidoscope fun mirror makes our men into savages, our women into whores, and our culture into knickknacks that you can buy at the ABC store. So this is where you come in. I'm hoping that the more that we can hold space for conversations like this, the more that we can talk and work together, the closer we can get to these collaborative ideas that Dr. Smith talks of. That together we can create welcoming, hospitable places, that we can find opportunities to come together and share our cultures rather than have outsiders take it or make rough approximations of it to turn a profit. I'm hoping that you will consider supporting this region that you profess to admire, because Pasifika currently faces several challenges, some that could lead to the disappearance of its lands, its culture, its peoples, such as climate change. While the islands of the Pacific collectively emit far below 1% of total global greenhouse gases responsible for climate change, the region and its island countries remain among the most vulnerable in the world to its negative impacts. It is anticipated that the Micronesian country of Kiribati will be the first nation to lose all of its land due to the effects of global warming by the year 2100. Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, and the Torres Strait Islands are also currently at very high risk. The desecration of sacred lands. Desecration of sacred lands continues to take place throughout the Pacific, though it takes many forms: in the name of the military, as in the case of Ritidian on Guam; science, as in the case of the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea; and private development, as in the case of Ihumatao and Aotearoa. The message is clear that Indigenous cultures will continue to be marginalized as settler colonialism sustains itself. Militarization. The militaries of the world continue to regard the Pacific as a playground for their war games and wide open for military positioning and poisoning. RIMPAC, which was scheduled to be held this year, was still held despite the coronavirus and despite strong oppositions from locals. The Runit Dome, which contains a massive amount of nuclear waste, is seeping into the Pacific Ocean in the Marshall Islands as we speak. Self-determination. There exist a number of colonies in the Pacific that should be given the opportunity to gain self-determination and achieve a more equitable relationship with their imperial power if they so please. Guam has demonstrated repeatedly that there is a strong internal movement towards Commonwealth status, while in West Papua, the other half of the island known as Papua New Guinea, which has been brutally held as a colony by Indonesia since 1969. Since then, it is estimated that Indonesian forces have murdered nearly 500,000 indigenous Papuans as they have struggled for freedom. The genocide continues to this day. Perhaps we should stop vacationing in Bali. Gentrification. On some islands, the cost of living and owning property has risen so significantly that many Pacific Islanders are forced to leave their own homes for work or to sustain themselves and their families, never to be able to return. While on Kauai, Mark Zuckerberg sues families to acquire the ancestral lands that abut his compound, as well as construct mile-long walls that obstruct views and ocean breezes that have been traditionally enjoyed in the community. And these are just to name a few. There are many other issues that also need urgent attention, such as poverty and economic development, lack of basic medical and health services on island, food sovereignty, cultural preservation, a colonized educational system, sex trafficking, domestic violence, the list goes on and on. I would hope that Tiki enthusiasts could love and support real multidimensional people, Pasifika people, and the issues that impact them, rather than simply glorify the narrow stereotypes that Tiki has defined us by. So these are some actions that you can take today. You've heard my opinion, and I'd love for you to search out other Pasifika voices, listen to them, and help amplify them. There aren't many of us. Remember, it's only 0.5% of the population. So we definitely need our help, need your help. Our individual experiences with colonization vary widely, as do our opinions, and it is valuable to your understanding to broaden your exposure. And again, I'm very thankful for your support of Pasifika Project today. Have the tough conversations. Talk with your friends and fellow Tiki enthusiasts. Take a step back and examine your own thoughts about Tiki. Notice any resistance or defensiveness. Try to work through that and keep talking. I also challenge you to taste the actual flavors of Oceania and experience culture from our own cultural practitioners. Support our small business owners and support our artists. Support movements and charitable organizations that address some of the pressing needs that we just outlined, perhaps with your Tiki Night fundraising, happy hour, benefits, or product launches or parties. Lastly, read and research. Prioritize sources from Indigenous authors, because what is notable about much of the research and fiction in the mainstream about Pasifika is the silence of Indigenous voices. And for every work that you read produced by a man, read two by women. Read our poetry, read our fiction, read our creation stories. And on the Pasifika Project website, we have a number of resources that you can explore, and I would urge you to check that out. I will leave you with more words from Aplia Hofa. We should not be defined by the smallness of our islands, but by the greatness of our oceans. We are the sea, we are the ocean. Oceania is us. We must wake up to this ancient truth and together overturn all hegemonic views that aim ultimately to confine us again, physically and psychologically. It is time to create things for ourselves, to create established standards of excellence that match those of our ancestors. And with that, thank you so much for listening and tuning in. Phoenix, are you there?
I am here. Wow, thank you so much for putting that together. That's so much great information that you put in such a short amount of time, and there's just a lot to unpack. And with that being said, we do have a couple of questions. Some of our audience members asked about different resources and organizations that you recommend on the communities, and you had mentioned that on Pasifika Project on the website, the resources are there. Are organizations to help these communities also listed on the website?
No, but there is a form that you can send us a message. So if you have any specific questions about, wanting more resources or anything like that, there's definitely a form that you can fill out and it goes straight to us and we'll be happy to answer those questions.
Okay, just off the top of your head, can you recommend any organizations that we should look into to help these communities?
So some of my very favorite ones are the Micronesia climate change. Micronesia climate change, it's like a bunch of words, but yeah, there's a, and then there's another one that's called NIHI, which is an organization that focuses on producing culturally based content for children that's based in Guam. So, addressing climate change and also addressing cultural preservation, those are sort of my two most favorite organizations.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And just another question, what's in store? What do you have planned for Pasifika Project in the future? Anything that we should be looking for and, helping promote?
Yeah, we are very excited about getting out of this coronavirus situation and doing more in person, really bringing the culture to folks who want to experience it. So we have plans for in-person events, but in the meantime, we're going to focus on some content creation, sort of get the word out about this vast number of cultures that you can find in the Pacific, but also highlighting folks that are doing really great stuff in the hospitality and food and beverage space as well, to sort of share that creativity, especially folks who are of oceanic descent around the world. So we're very excited. It's still pretty early stages. The best way to keep track of us is going to be on Instagram. And that's where we'll probably start pushing out the information first. But we're exceptionally grateful for folks that want to be involved or get in contact. Again, there's a contact form on the website. So if you have any ideas or you just want to talk, please send us an email. We'd love it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time. Tiki Oasis, we hope to have you in Pasifika Project in the future.
We'd love
To
that.
educate. So thank you again for your time. And thank you to our audience members for being part of this conversation and for listening to Mariah. We ask that you consider making a donation. You can make your donation through PayPal. Send it over to tikioasis@gmail.com, and all of the donations will be shared to the Pasifika Project.
Great.
Thank you. And we hope that everyone else joins us next month on the second Sunday at 11 a.m. Pacific time as Sly Augustine of Trailer of Happiness, based in London, will share with us a history of rum and how it's influenced the past and present drinking cultures and politics. So thank you again, everyone, for dialing in. Bye.